Good morning, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all for being here this morning as we have our fourth community meeting to talk about our facilities task force and the recommendations that they have shared. We're going to start this morning. Recognize our board president, Mr. Gary Baker, is here. Thank you. And I appreciate it because what these meetings are all about are making sure that the members of our task force, the members of our board really hear that community feedback. So with that, I'm going to ask Dr. John Stanford to come up and make some introductory remarks before we get into the plans.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everyone. Good morning. How are you all doing? Awesome. Well, thank you all very, very much for coming out this early morning to hear the presentation and to give us your feedback on the different proposals that have been, recommended by the Facilities Task Force. Your input is absolutely critical, because these school buildings are community school buildings, right? And that's how we view them as a school district, right? And so we have some tough decisions to make because of the changing demographics of our community and the ebb and flow of the populations in our community, and the choices that parents are making for their children requires us to really make some tough decisions, but we can do it as a community, right? Because at the bottom line, it's about the 52,000 students of this district and what we owe to them as adults who have the responsibility to provide them a high-quality education. And so I know I've gone way off script, Scott, but again, thank you all very much for coming out this morning. Your presence here this morning is proof of your interest and your desire to see what is best about what is best for our children in Columbus City Schools. It is also a recognition of your deep passion for our students and for Columbus City Schools as a whole. In all of my years in this district, I have learned that change and advancements in Columbus City Schools are always made stronger when we have the input of the community, when we have the input of people like yourselves, and we are able to hear your voices in the recommendations that are made as a part of the process. And that requires that we listen to all community voices. It requires that we make sure that we reach out to every corner of our community, not just some. From the beginning of this process, we have tried to reflect those statements in our efforts. When you look at our facilities task force, it is a community-led task force that was formed back in the spring, and it is filled with members of our community all across the city of Columbus. They are volunteer members who have volunteered their time and have rearranged their schedules to participate in this process. They represent not only the vastness of our community, they represent different organizations that work directly with our students and our families. They represent the diversity of our community. They represent teachers and staff members who work within Columbus City Schools. And I have to share with you all that these individuals represented the community well. They were not just yes people sitting at the table. They voiced their opinions and they voiced their concerns with us on a regular basis. They were not shy about pushing back on us, and we welcome that as district leaders. So at this time, I do see Mr. Baker's already been introduced to the crowd, but I do see a couple of members from the task force that are present here this morning. So for a couple of task force members, if you would stand and be acknowledged as for your hard work over the last several months. And then I also want to recognize all of the staff people, including Scott Varner, our Executive Director for Communications, but they're all sitting in the back at the tables, and they will be facilitating your conversations later on. But if we could give them a round of applause for all the hard work that they've done. Since April of this year, the members of our Facilities Task Force have examined data and information provided to them by our professional staff members. That data covered all 110 schools in our district. And it also covered all of our administrative buildings in our district. All of our buildings were reviewed by this task force through the lens of the data. And it was a three-part process of looking at the data quantitatively, looking at the data and information qualitatively, and then looking at the impact of that data and information on the different options that were being considered. In each of our buildings, our teams looked at both the challenges and opportunities brought on by factors ranging from building conditions, the capacity to facilitate high-quality education for our students, student enrollment, and transfer rates between schools and between attendance zones of one school to attendance zones of another school. By the end of the presentation this morning, I hope you will all appreciate the depth of the information and our process that has been data-driven and very respectful of all of the factors that must be considered as a part of this process. Our task force members and our district leaders are here this morning with open minds and open hearts and a willingness to have a constructive conversation with you all this morning about our options. Again, no decisions have been made, okay? These are all preliminary recommendations. The reason we are here this morning is to hear from you on these preliminary recommendations. So don't be afraid to speak up and speak your mind. Staff from the district, as I mentioned, are in the back, and they will be capturing your feedback throughout this morning to share with the task force. The task force will meet again in October, and at that meeting, they will receive all of the information from our community forums and from this morning, and all of the information that we have received online, and they will consider that in making a final set of recommendations to the Board of Education. If you are not able to get all of your thoughts out this morning, don't worry. We've got plenty of other avenues that Mr. Varner will share with you during the presentation. And those are all online or traditional snail mail or just picking up the phone and calling our contact office, our customer relations office, and providing your feedback there. Many of the voices were part of the process, the facilities master plan process 2 years ago. And we want to be clear that this is not that process. The facilities master plan is the district's blueprint for future construction and renovation of buildings all across the district. This process this morning is not about building new or renovating old buildings to make them new. This process this morning is really about digging into the data and making tough decisions, again, based on the ebb and flow of our community. The future conversations about new buildings or renovated buildings will have to happen in the future. And it will have to be a much larger conversation than we're having right now, because it will require us to get the feedback and the voices of our voters and you to consider another large bond package in order to build new buildings or to renovate our old buildings. We don't have that money right now to consider that, and that's why this process is a lot different. This process is also generated by the board's policy, and that policy requires the administration to monitor our enrollment on a regular basis. And when we see ebb and flow in our student population from one building to another, and it affects the enrollment of a building where it's underutilized, that policy then requires the superintendent to form a community task force to then look at the data and the information to determine if there are recommendations that should be made in order to address underutilized buildings in the school district. So we are looking at how best to use the current buildings that we have in the districts right now. And we want to ask ourselves the question, how do we ensure that we are using our buildings to their maximum in order to achieve maximum academic offerings for our students? We need to ask that question because they deserve a high-quality education. And I think we all would agree that students should come first in this process. But I also know that there's always an emotional component when proposals such as the preliminary recommendations create any type of change in our community. And rightfully so, because these conversations have huge magnitude and impact across the community. When we are considering the closure or the consolidation of historic buildings and historic changes within our school district. And that should never be taken lightly. It should never be taken lightly because as I started out, we understand completely that these buildings are a part of the community. As you are sharing your thoughts with us this morning, I would ask 4 things of you. First, we are not here this morning to debate past decisions. And the reason why we are not here to debate those past decisions is because we cannot go back and reverse them. They've already been made. Second, we want to embrace the history and the legacies of our schools and respect that history and those legacies. But we cannot let the history and the legacies of these schools prevent us from considering change. Again, because we have 52,000 students that we are making decisions for. There are some realities that we have to face. And those realities, again, as I mentioned before, is tied to the underutilization of our buildings. When our buildings are underutilized, our students are being deprived of a high-quality education because we are unable to provide a full complement of educational opportunities and classes for them because you cannot have, let's say, a French 4 class with just 3 students in it. It's just not economically feasible. It's not a good business model for the district to utilize. Third, as you are thinking about these options, please do not underestimate the resiliency of our students, their grit, and their ability to adapt to change when it is done with a proper process. And we have gone through these type of tough decisions in the past, and we have utilized those type of processes to work with our students and our families to help them adapt to that change, and our staff members to help them adapt to that change. Last but not least, my request is to please keep an open mind about the proposals that you are about to hear this morning. When you review the information and you are having the discussion, please just have an open mind. And again, keep the 52,000 students in our district in your mind as well, and at the forefront of any thoughts that you have about the opportunities that you're going to hear. So again, thank you all very, very much for coming out this morning. Thank you for taking the time to share your thoughts and your insights about these opportunities and these options, and for listening to us this morning. So at this point, I am going to turn the microphone back over to Mr. Varner so he can lead you through the presentation.
Thank you. Well, good morning again. Thank you all for being here, and I know many of you have already had an opportunity to see these recommendations, have been at some of the other community meetings. We've all chatted before, but I was reminded as I was listening to Dr. Stanford, we have a number of folks who are watching these videos, that we're on Facebook Live, that we carry all of these community meetings live again. So For the crowd that is here, welcome, but also for those who watch virtually, we welcome them too, and I think we have a number of folks who are watching. So I am going to take just a little bit of time to go back through the process to make sure that everybody, those who are here and those who are watching virtually, have an opportunity to best understand all the work that has been done since April to get us to this point, and then the work that still needs to be done. We always think it's important to remind ourselves what the role of this task force was. Dr. Stanford touched upon a lot of it, but for this task force, remember the goal was to, with assistance from experts from the district, to give this community group the best opportunity to understand national best practices, some of our historic work, and really that subject matter expertise on looking at all 110 of our buildings as they thought about recommendations. We wanted to make sure that their recommendations came with a statement of rationale. These weren't just decisions made blindly, but decisions made with a lot of data and backing behind them. They were also built out of board policy. So the board policy actually sets a number of criteria that we must look at and consider as we think about any impacts to our buildings. Again, as we think about the timeline, the goal is to have many of these decisions made in October and November, so that we can then look forward ahead to the calendar and for school choice for our families that then may consider other buildings. Here is that calendar. So we think about the work that started in April has moved all the way through to here in September. The task force has devoted all of September, and as we'll talk a little bit more later, we've actually devoted parts of October as well to continue to collect more of that community feedback. As Dr. Stanford shared, decisions are best made when we hear all voices, and so this task force is really asked to hear more voices before submitting their final recommendations to the Board of Education for a possible decision in November. Again, all based upon that calendar so that when our school lottery program begins in January, young people know, their families know the future of what a building may have. So let me just quickly kind of walk through the process and how we got to where we got to. Always as part of the discussion, it first began about the benefit of our students and their academics, to making sure that the use of our buildings, how we use our buildings, was a positive for our student, that it was a benefit and not a hindrance. That the use of our buildings was a positive for our students and not a hindrance. And then secondly, the effective use of our buildings. How are we making sure that we're best utilizing the resources that we have, our buildings being best utilized in the facilities? So with that, as Dr. Stanford mentioned, we kind of then took kind of three approaches. The task force looked at just raw numbers, data. Then they started looking at qualitative information, just some of the qualities of a building, the programming, the types of community supports that are there. And then finally, they looked at the impact. That the request was that if you were going to make any change to a building, whether it was something as simple as a changing an attendance boundary or making some significant recommendations, that you had to think about the impact. What was it going to mean for the students, for their families, for the community, and for any other school that was impacted? So here's kind of what that data looks like. So again, in this first phase of information, we looked at really, the task force was given raw numbers. How many students attended a building? How many students? What was their enrollment? And then when you looked at the number of students assigned to a building, and then the size of the building, and compared those, what was the utilization? Is a building half full? Is it kind of right around capacity? Is it over capacity? Is it overcrowded? Then we looked at the condition of the buildings. Are they newer buildings? Have they been through the facilities master plan? Have they been renovated or replaced? Or are they some of our older buildings? Do they have air conditioning? It was an important question over the last month. And then we looked at transfer in and transfer out rates. And I think many of you are familiar with that within our district where we have choice, we allow for students and families to pick schools that are maybe not in their neighborhood. So we wanted to look at each building and better understand how many students live in a neighborhood and choose to go elsewhere. And more importantly, looking back, in a building, how many choose to come in. And so we better understand where folks are moving. Then the task force looked at some of those qualitative issues. Again, we looked at the educational programming. If it's a STEM school, is that STEM program being offered with fidelity? We looked at the access to it. Are there safe sidewalks or safe ways for folks to access the building? What about the accessibility for our students with disabilities? What's the future use of that property? Then we even looked at things like residential trends. Fortunately, with some help from our partners at MORPC, we were able to start to look at some of the planning pieces that are around our city and where we expect to see more families moving into, not just residential growth, but more importantly, growth of residents where there are going to be young people that we're going to need to have schooling for. We looked at the wait list. We looked at grade band design. You're going to hear me talk about this a few different times this morning. Grade band design being that as part of that facilities master plan process, we really heard from our community about trying to get back to a more traditional grade band design in which we have our traditional K through 5 elementaries, and where possible pre-K through 5, middle schools that are grades 6, 7, and 8, and then high schools that are 9, 10, 11, 12. That more traditional dedicated elementary, dedicated middle, dedicated high school. As you know, in this district, we've actually kind of looked at different options, and in many cases, we have some 7-12 buildings, we have some K-6 buildings, we have some K-8 buildings, and so it's really looking at, the push was really to kind of go back to that more traditional design. Gosh, we even looked at the number of work orders, the number of times we send a repair guy out to a building and getting some of that better information. Then finally, as we talked about, we looked at that impact. Again, if you're going to make any change to a building at any level, better make sure we better understand if there's going to be relocation, what that impact is going to be, what potential burdens might we cause on students or families if they have to move, or to a building that then has to accept additional students, and really making sure that we are doing everything we can to ensure that we have the best space to accommodate everyone. So that's the criteria that everyone looked at as we looked at all 110 buildings, all 110. This was not just subject to some, but it was really subject to all. We looked at all buildings. So with all of that data, an opportunity to talk about the challenges facing and opportunities facing the district, the task force came up with 5 recommendations. So I'm going to walk through all 5 of them as quickly as possible, and then after that, we'll then move back and make sure that we get your feedback on all of these. So the first recommendation involves 3 of our elementary schools on the west side. This is Highland, West Broad, and Westgate Elementary. And the proposal here, these are, especially as we look at West Broad Street, it's a building that is probably a little over capacity or really right at. We wanted to look at a way to better balance the enrollment in that neighborhood. We also had an interesting safety issue because if you've ever driven down West Broad Street, that's a pretty dangerous spot to have young people crossing. So what this proposal does is it looks at those 3 elementaries. We actually looked at a 4th because Valley View's in that neighborhood. But really these are the 3 that are kind of in that, that are closest together, where we would kind of redraw the attendance boundaries to better balance enrollment in that neighborhood. And then at the same time, try to eliminate the number of young people that have to cross West Broad Street. So what this proposal does, and it's easier to see on the map, is currently, if you live anywhere in this blue kind of purple shaded area, you attend West Broad Street, or West Broad Elementary. This line right here represents, or is where West Broad Street is, all the cars that run along here, and then this is Hague Avenue here, which can also be very busy at times. What this proposal says is that if you are living in this neighborhood, instead you will go to Highland Elementary. So if you live in this neighborhood and currently attend West Broad, you would move to Highland Elementary. And again, so you don't have to cross busy West Broad Street. Highland Elementary is also a building that has received some additional investment. We're adding air to that building as part of Operation Fix-It and the repairs that are gone on there. On this side of Hague, again, this little area currently goes to West Broad. We would change this attendance boundary to go over to Westgate Elementary. Again, keeping young people from having to cross any busy roads and still maintaining very close to where their neighborhood is. So that's a pretty easy proposal. Again, as a way to better balance attendance in that zone or in this area, to better balance enrollment, and then to avoid some of the safety issues of crossing West Broad Street. That one's pretty simple. In the community meetings, we asked everyone to show, with a show of hands of who was here for this. I know where everyone's at here on this one, so we don't need to do the show of hands, but I just want to make sure everyone best understands that example. The second one is very similar. We look at North Linden Elementary and Mays Elementary. Again, here's an elementary school in North Linden where it is over capacity. Mays Elementary being a little under capacity. So to best balance that enrollment, we propose redrawing kind of the attendance boundaries. There's also a special unit at North Linden that works with our English as a second language families, those young people who come into the district that are still trying to learn English as their primary language. There's currently a lot of work that with those families at North Linden. By doing this change, we probably would have to add an ESL location at Mays Elementary. But that's a good thing. That's a better way to serve all of our ESL families in that community. So again, let me show you the map because it makes it so much easier to see. Currently, if you live in the purple area, you go to North Linden. The proposal is to take these two attendance boundaries at the top and move those to Mays Elementary. It really is about one because this first attendance boundary is the site of the former Northland Mall that has been fully redeveloped. And there aren't too many families that live at Menards, and so I think we're okay to look at this one, but it's really this neighborhood where you would send over to Mays Elementary. Again, that one's pretty simple about changing it. So let's move into those that are a little more complicated, and I think really kind of focus in on the best use of our building. So this one involves our Columbus North International High School, the Columbus Global Academy, Dominion Middle School, as well as our two immersion programs, Spanish immersion and French immersion, and then Hubbard Mastery. So what this proposal does is we look at, for the North International program, which is currently at the former North High School, that we would move the 9th through 12th grades, the high school grades, down to the former Brookhaven site and co-locate them with the Columbus Global Academy. So you would take the high school grades out of the North building and move the Columbus International High School recreated at Brookhaven to co-locate with Columbus Global Academy. That then leaves this nice North High School building open, and the proposal is to take the students, staff, families from Dominion and put them in that North High School building to kind of create this Dominion North Middle School. So we recreate Dominion over in the North building, a much bigger building. Dominion currently is over capacity. I think they're about 120% right now, so it is a building that is quite full of young people to give them this greater high school opportunity or size. In addition, though, there's still more space in that building. So our other proposal is, as we look at our immersion programs, pull the 6th graders out of those Columbus Spanish immersion and Ecole Kenwood French immersion, as well as Hubbard Mastery, take those 6th graders and put them in this middle school. Again, an opportunity to get that true middle school experience, but also for our immersion programs, kind of address one of the challenges that they face is not having a dedicated middle school for those young people. You often see a lot of folks leave the program after 5th grade because we don't have a dedicated place for them. So you would move those 6th graders into this new Dominion North Middle School. And with that, an opportunity to create this great new program at Dominion that would be their STEAM focus, STEAM being kind of that STEM focus, but with arts, as well as add in this language immersion program to create something very unique and I think very impactful. So why do you do it? So again, when we talk about utilization, when we think about how best we are using the Brookhaven site and currently how we best use the North building, by doing this, it would help us best utilize that former Brookhaven site. We heard a lot of community support during that facilities master plan process about these two programs coexisting. Although the International High School program wasn't initially started to be about our international flavor. It was about being International Baccalaureate, which is more of an academic piece, but it really has taken on more of that international flavor, and so many diverse communities and languages spoken within that program really could co-locate with the Columbus Global, I think, quite well. It would give us that opportunity to restore that grade banding. Again, international right now is a 7-12, and so we have 7th and 8th graders who are in high school, and how do we get them back to that middle school experience? For our global students, we would also see this as an opportunity. Though they have a home high school that they would normally go back to, we could make a reservation in this international high school so they could stay within that building, stay within that community that they're a part of. For Dominion, this is an opportunity by using that north building, that would provide much needed space, Dominion being overcrowded. North is also a pretty good building, having received several repairs. It does not have air conditioning, but it has had about $1.8 million in investments over the last couple years to really improve the site. Which I think, and then by having that bigger space, as you heard Dr. Stanford say, whenever we have bigger spaces and larger enrollments, you have more opportunities to offer diverse programming. And just think about, that's a much larger theater space for those young people. There are high school level science labs there. That's pretty good if you're in middle school and have that access to some of those different opportunities. And as we mentioned, kind of that academics being able to offer both that combination of the STEAM and the language immersion. It also addresses, as we mentioned, it also addresses what we see as a transfer issue in our language immersion programs, because currently those are K-6s, and so you see a large drop-off after 5th grade because young people want to get into a middle school. They don't want to get to 6th grade and then not know where they're going. And so we often see in our language immersion programs a drop after 5th grade. This would address that. They'd be able to continue that immersion programming at a dedicated middle school. It might also allow us to address, by moving those 6th graders out in those 2 new buildings for Spanish immersion and French immersion, to actually improve the wait list, to actually take in more students, and potentially, and each of those I think have pre-K. And again, it gives us that true middle school experience. So I just want to show you this map real quick, because I think it helps as we think about Dominion. Right now, if you're in the purple area, your assigned middle school is Dominion. We would move you down to the North High School building, currently where International High School is. So you see that we stay within the neighborhood. And in fact, our mapping people are so good. They looked at all of the households of those who live in the Dominion and attend Dominion, and they created the average center, or kind of the center of where all those families are, and you see that's this little white dot. So we actually stay really close to where most of our young people who live in that area are. The red dots represent those who currently attend International that would be moving to Global. So as you see, we're really keeping young people, keeping schools where we're close to young people. So that's that proposal. Let me get into the last two, and I think those are the two that have had the most focus on it. And that is, the first one is looking at East High School and Lyndon McKinley, as well as the elementaries that currently feed into Lyndon McKinley, as well as Mifflin Middle School and Medina Middle School. So the challenges that we have here begin with making sure that we are best utilizing those buildings and providing the best academic opportunities. So the proposal here is that we convert Lyndon McKinley from a high school to a middle school. Convert Lyndon McKinley from a high school to a middle school. How do you do that? So you take the current high school grades that are at Lyndon McKinley, and you move those to East. So anyone who would come up to that feeder pattern would instead go to East High School through the Lyndon McKinley Middle School. As you know, Lyndon McKinley is currently a 7 through 12, so those 7th and 8th graders who are currently at Lyndon McKinley would stay. You would keep those there. In that neighborhood that feeds into Lyndon McKinley, we have a lot of those K-6 buildings, those elementaries where we have the K-6. You would pull all of those 6th grades out of those elementary schools and put those into this new Lyndon McKinley Middle School. To even more so better use that space, at both Mifflin and Medina Middle Schools, we currently have those ESL units. In fact, one of them is a sheltered site where we have additional supports for our families. We would actually pull those and move those to this new Lyndon McKinley Middle School, providing them actually some better and larger space to operate and serve our families. Now, because this proposal involves, as you may know, East High School is a part of the Ohio State University, their health sciences academies, and the Lyndon program has a pretty strong STEM program. Because it will take a little time to kind of work that out, because we want to make sure that young people going up through either of those feeder patterns have the best opportunities in high school. So this actually would it would take us 2 years to implement this. While the other proposals so far have been, over the next year. I take it back. Dominion's a 2-year program too, I'm sorry. So Dominion is 2 years. This would be 2 years, just because of the complexity of it. And then when when we're able to pull those ESL units out of Mifflin and Medina, we see that the enrollments in those buildings, the utilization go down, that we could actually combine those two, merge those two schools, and close Mifflin Middle School, which is probably the older building of the two. So that's the proposal. So let's talk about the why. I want to make sure everyone understands the why the task force put this proposal together. First is building utilization. How are we making sure that our buildings aren't empty? Currently, the utilization at East High School is 51%. 51%. That doesn't mean if you go over there, you're going to see empty classroom spaces. Just as we are in our homes, we all fill out our entire home, but how much more space is available for more students? And that's what we see at East High School, 51% utilization. Lyndon McKinley is at 76% utilization. So by making this merge, we've better fully utilized both of those buildings. Academics, by having two middle schools, Champion Middle School and now this new Lyndon McKinley Middle School feeding into East, not only are you creating a larger student body at East High School, but as Dr. Stanford shared, by having more students, you're now able to offer greater academic programming. He talked about the French 4 class. If there's only 2 or 3 young people who want that advanced class, it's kind of hard to justify having a teacher for just 3 students. But when you double, triple, when you create more of an enrollment, suddenly that 3 students becomes 20, or more, and that makes it more appealing and better able for the district budget-wise to do that. Grade band, it gets us back to that traditional grade banding that we've talked about by creating that true middle school experience. We don't have 6th graders in elementary, and we don't have 7th and 8th graders in high school. We also get more elementary space by pulling those 6th graders out at those elementary buildings. That gives us more space to address some of the non-academic barriers that our young people face. But more importantly, it may allow us to add pre-K in some of those buildings. That's if there's additional funding that comes along from the state and city to do that. But one of our challenges is first making sure there's space, and then when there's funding, you could add pre-K to some of those buildings. It's also then improved service for our ESL families. In that newer space at Lyndon McKinley, it would be larger space to allow us to best serve those families. By combining the Mifflin and Medina allows us to close one of the buildings. And I think, again, if you know Mifflin, one of the challenges there is just it's an older building. And so it allows us to address one of those issues. One of the other points, and I think the task force was very mindful of this, was trying to remember, as Dr. Stanford shared, that there's great pride and legacy in our high school buildings. And so this plan does not remove the building. It may change it to a middle school, but it tries to maintain that building as a point of pride in the neighborhood. And I already talked about the 2-year implementation of this plan. So let me just kind of help, again, make sure everyone best understands kind of what the proposal is. So East High School now would be served by 2 middle schools. These 4 elementaries that currently feed into the Lyndon McKinley High School now instead would feed into this new middle school program. From a map, you can kind of see where the new East High School feeder pattern would be both of these areas. So anyone who lives in these areas would be assigned through their feeder pattern to East High School. This just shows kind of where all of those 6th graders would be coming from. Currently in those neighborhoods, those 6th graders would move to Lyndon McKinley. And finally, once we pull those ESL services out of these 2 buildings, keeping it within that neighborhood, keeping it very close by to those who are being served by that, to the newer space that allows you to combine both of these attendance areas and have everyone go to Medina. Let me run through the last one and then we'll get to the community, or get to your comments. So this is a very similar plan on the south side if we move to this final recommendation. Again, where we have underutilized buildings, an opportunity to get back to some of that traditional grade banding, then to also create opportunities for larger enrollments that will allow us to provide more academic options. And so this is very similar in that we look at Marion Franklin High School and South High School and the feeder pattern that goes into it. So what would this proposal do? So it would turn Marion Franklin High School into a middle school. Maintain the building, but you change Marion Franklin High School to Marion Franklin Middle School. The high school students that are currently at Marion Franklin would move to South. South is currently one of those 712 buildings, so the 7th and 8th graders that are currently at South would now go to this Marion Franklin Middle School. We also have Buckeye Middle School, so that 6th, 7th, and 8th graders at Buckeye Middle School would now move into this new Marion Franklin Middle School, and that would allow us to close Buckeye. Buckeye, again, being an older building, no air conditioning there. Marion Franklin, an older building, but we are adding air conditioning there as part of Operation Fix-It. For the elementary schools that are in the South feeder pattern that currently are K through 6, you pull those 6th graders out, you move those into the middle school, providing some additional space in each of those. So let me just quickly advance to the whys. I want to make sure everyone understands kind of why the task force put these proposals together. First, looking at utilization. Currently at Marion Franklin, similar to East, 53% utilization. 53%. By having 9 elementary schools now feed into this one middle school, you're able to increase the utilization, and that building can handle having 9 elementaries feeding into it. It allows us to restore that more traditional grade banding on the South feeder pattern, so we no longer have the 7th and 8th graders in high school, 6th graders in elementary. The larger enrollments allow for more academic opportunities, and we've already talked about that Marion Franklin has actually seen a lot of improvements to that building through our Operation Fix-It that was approved by voters back in 2016. Elementary space. More space at the elementary allows us to better address some of those challenges at our elementary level, where possible adding pre-K. Now another part of this, and I'm sorry I didn't mention it before, it wasn't intentional. As we look at moving those 6th graders out of some of the elementary schools, that actually provides some new space to address one of our other older buildings, which is Siebert Elementary. We would actually be able to take those students who live in that Siebert neighborhood, who currently attend Siebert, and transition them to going to Southwood Elementary or Stewart Elementary, both of which are brand new buildings still in that neighborhood. And that would allow us to close Siebert Elementary, again, an older building, closing that. We get to that true middle school experience in this neighborhood, and again, the task force being mindful of the history and legacy at both of those buildings and making sure that we still maintain those buildings and the points of pride that they bring with them in the neighborhood. Again, the maps, I think, make this so much easier to understand. So the feeder pattern now is these 9 elementaries feed into the Marion Franklin Middle School. Off this list are Buckeye, so we would close the Buckeye Middle School building, as well as closing the Siebert Elementary building. The map over here shows you what the new boundaries would be for South High School. So Marion Franklin families would now go up to South High School. This just kind of shows you where those middle school students are all coming from that would now go to this new Marion Franklin Middle School. And finally, a better explanation for Siebert Elementary, an elementary where there are only a handful of young people who live in that neighborhood and attend that school. Again, there's a high transfer in rate, a high placement rate by the district. We place additional students in that building. We would instead redraw this, and young people would either go to Stewart Elementary, brand new building, or Southwood Elementary, another newer building. So those are those proposals. Now the task force also looked at, as Dr. Stanford mentioned, our administrative buildings, including this building that we're in this morning. I didn't put those plans up there because I know most of your focus has been on the school sites and the impact to your families. And so if you have questions about the administrative site recommendations, I'm happy after we're done with this presentation to kind of run those through with you individually, just so you have a sense of kind of the recommendations for our administrative buildings and those that they have the task force recommending to close quickly, to consider moving, or to study a little bit further. But I want to get to the most important part of the morning, and that is making sure that we get your feedback.
Just for those who are online, you may want to mention that this is on.
Oh, great point. For those who are online and want more about the administrative site, as you go down on our website, and I'll make sure you have the address for that here in just a second, you'll be able to see those recommendations. But let's get to the important part, and that's the community feedback, is hearing from you. So we will share after today's meeting that we're actually going to add some additional community meeting dates. We want to make sure that we hear from every voice. And so as we were out at the community meetings, especially at Linda McKinley and Marion Franklin, we heard from one part of the impact, but not necessarily the other. So we want to make sure that we get an opportunity to hear more voices as we consider these proposals. So we'll be announcing 3 more additional community meetings for that first week of October, right after we're done with this meeting. Online, go to our website, ccsoh.us. You will see a link. One of the first things that pops up will be a link where you can get more information and an explanation of all of these recommendations. But we still want to hear from you in many other ways. So we have the Columbus City Schools mobile app. If you have that on your phone, one of the first buttons you will see is an opportunity to provide feedback on the app. You can call us at 614-365-8888. That's our customer relations helpline, and the folks on that line are ready to take your information. You can email us at talk to us at columbus.k12.oh.us. And for those who still like to write a letter, we even have our mailing address. So now we want to move to the part of the meeting where we get your feedback. And so at the tables at the back, we've set up where you have an opportunity to sit and share. We want to make sure to record your comments. And as Dr. Stanford mentioned, these comments are taken. We're not trying to translate to change your opinion, to convince you one way or the other. It's really more to get your feedback, and so that we can share that directly with the task force. A couple of the questions to think about, though, as you go to that table. I want to make sure that when you get to the table that you fully understand the proposals. Again, all of us, I think, that are here have seen these proposals before. I think you're well familiar, but if there's any part of it that you don't understand, who's moving where and how, or the timing of it, please make sure to ask that question of our team. But the other 2 parts are, what is some of the information that you don't think we have? There may be some parts, some data, that though we've looked at 20 different criteria, there may be one piece that we don't know. And so what is it that you would like the task force to also consider? And then secondly, do you have another recommendation? You heard some of the challenges and opportunities we laid out, and these are one proposal to address that, but perhaps you have other ideas, and so I hope you'll share that with the representatives in the back. So with that, I'll say thank you for your coming in this morning and being a part of this process. And as Dr. Stanford said, our decisions are always made better when we hear from all voices, and so we really appreciate you sharing yours today. Thank you.